Hello, Sunlight. Pastor Scott asked me to do a few sessions on how we build relationships with unchurched people. And sometimes we use that word evangelism. I don't like to use that word, even though it's a perfect word. It's just that so many people get wrong images when it comes to evangelism because they say, well, I can't be Billy Graham. There's no way I can be Billy Graham. And I don't want to be those guys in the suits and ties that are kind of pushy and obnoxious that knock on people's doors. You know, that's the two pictures of evangelism that we have. And most people are like, I don't want to be either one of those, so I just don't want to be a part of evangelism. And even for unchurched people, evangelism is like a kind of a dirty word. It's kind of a pushy, self-righteous, that's the images that comes to people's minds when they hear the word evangelism. So building bridges of grace. Let's try that on for size. How do we build bridges of grace? And that is a picture of a pedestrian bridge at Florida International University. Pretty nice looking bridge, isn't it? They actually built that bridge off to the side. They didn't build it across the road. They built it and then they picked it up and they moved it and set it into place. Great idea, huh? Not so much. That is the Florida International University Bridge after they installed it. And sadly, it killed some people, not only pedestrians on the bridge, but cars underneath the bridge that were moving. Because after they had it in place, it wasn't very long and things just went terribly wrong. And in the research and the reading that I did, here's what I could find about what actually went wrong. They overestimated the strength of the bridge in key load-bearing sections, and they underestimated how much weight key load-bearing sections would carry. Sounds simple enough explanation, right? Good excuse. We overestimated, we underestimated. When it comes to building bridges of grace with people in our lives, one of the biggest mistakes we make right out of the outset is we overestimate what our role is and we underestimate what God's role is. And it is so important that we get this right at the beginning, that we understand what our part is, what we do, and we understand what God does in transforming people's lives. Changing people's hearts is really, really hard. Nearly impossible. Engaging people's hearts is really, really fun. At least to me, building relationships with people, understanding them better, being with people who are different from me, I just think that's one of the most fun things you can do. That's why Pastor Scott asked me to do this. That's why I've done it in other settings, because I just love building relationships with people. And that is at the heart of evangelism. And I think anyone can do it. I know for some of you, your personality isn't that way. You're not wired up to be extroverted. You're not wired up to be outgoing. You might be more of an introvert. I hope some of the things that we talk about in this time together will help you say, I can still be an introvert and connect with people. Because introverts, it's a misnomer, because a lot of people think, well, if I'm an introvert, I don't like people. That is not true. You just have to work a little harder and invest more energy in being with people. You love people. Whether history says that or not, you're wired up to be in community. Every single one of us is. And I think we leave the changing hearts in God's arena. That's what He does. We don't have to change people's hearts. We have to engage people. We have to love people. And we allow God to do what He does, and we do what He's called us and commanded us to do. And some of us, have the gift of evangelism. But that does not mean that God has reserved evangelism only for those who have the gift and that passion for evangelism. Sharing, building those bridges of grace, helping people know who Jesus Christ is something that every single follower of Christ is called and commissioned to do. It's what He's called us to do. There is a story in Luke chapter 10 where Jesus sends out His followers and He gives them some simple instructions, says, don't take too much with you, now go. And they go and they encounter people. They do what God commands them to do in bringing the message of who Jesus Christ is, and amazing things happen. They come back and they are so excited, so pumped about how they've seen God's power displayed, how more people want to know who Jesus is and are coming to hear him and follow him. And Jesus is excited too. He even says, I saw Satan fall like lightning. You know, whether he's talking literally or whether he's just saying, man, you turned the world upside down in what you did just now, in bringing grace, building bridges of grace to the people all around you. And then he says this is really interesting in Luke chapter 10, verse 20. He says, however, you know, they've been casting out demons and healing people and doing amazing, miraculous signs. He says this, however, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. See, I want us to remember the difference between, you know, the power of God working through us and what our identity is, what our gospel identity is. Because Jesus here says, I don't want you to get caught up in the signs. Sometimes we can get caught up in the church. Well, we saw so many people come to Christ, hundreds of people. You know, we get caught up in the numbers, or we get caught up, you know, we saw somebody get healed and we just get so excited about this powerful display that God showed us through signs and miracles. And God does those things. But Jesus warns his followers, don't get caught up in the numbers. Don't get caught up in the big splashy things. You get caught up in who you are in me, that your names are written in heaven, that you are a child of God. See, that's your gospel identity. And the more you get excited about that, caught up in that, the more you rehearse the gospel in your own life, the more it flows from who you are. And then building bridges of grace isn't something that you have to force. It's something that flows from who you are. St. Patrick is one of my favorite guys. Do you know that St. Patrick, who is celebrated as the greatest Irishman ever, was not Irish? Isn't that amazing? I mean, it wasn't an Irish guy. When he was young, he was kidnapped by the barbaric Irish people. He was brought to Ireland and forced into slavery. He tended sheep and did all sorts of labor that nobody else wanted to do as a slave. One day God spoke to him and says, your ship has come in, and he runs, he escapes his slavery, he goes back home. He goes into training in the church to become a pastor, priest, missionary, you know, and he, in the process of his training, he feels and hears God call him back to the people of Ireland. Can you imagine? I mean, here are the people that captured and enslaved you, and now you're going to go back and be a missionary to those people. I don't know, I know there's been many missionaries who've had incredible impact, but I am totally amazed at the impact that St. Patrick had on a whole nation of people. I mean, the Irish people were literally transformed by the work that St. Patrick did among those people. And I think there are some key things. There's a guy who wrote a book called The Celtic Way of Evangelism. And it's a great book. I'd encourage you to read it. I believe it's George Hunter who wrote the book. But he identifies some key things that St. Patrick did to have so much incredible impact. By the way, there's another book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it talks in more detail about the life of St. Patrick and the impact that he had on the world. It's a historian. It's not a Christian perspective, but it's a historian who writes about the book of St. Patrick and the impact that his influence had on the world, ultimately. But that's another story. Let's get back to the Celtic way of evangelism. One of the first things that George Hunter talks about is that we belong before we believe. We belong before we believe. A good friend of mine, his name's John. His wife started coming to our church. This is probably, 20 years ago now, that his wife started coming to our church. They were going through a difficult time in their lives. His wife started coming to church, but that had not been John's experience. Did not grow up in church. His parents didn't go to church. It was kind of a foreign place for him. But as his wife started coming to church, John showed up, and John connected with me. And it's just amazing. We just became good friends. John didn't like the church so much. I don't think he was crazy about coming with his wife. He did. He didn't like church, but he liked me, and I liked him. We had a lot of things in common. We both loved to play basketball. We had kids around the same age, so we started playing basketball together with our kids and spending time together, just having fun as a family. And I honestly don't know when it happened. I don't know that John even knows when it happened, that he became a follower of Christ. He went from being so disconnected and far from God to being one of the best leaders that our church had. But I do remember the day that John was baptized. It was out in the park in the sunshine in the summertime in Indiana, and it was one of my highlights of ministry in my life, because here was a guy who was such a good friend of mine. That's part of what I think is so important in evangelism, is sometimes we treat people like they're a project. People know it when we think of them as projects. I never want to treat somebody like they're a project. I didn't think of John that way. I just thought of John as my friend, and I love spending time with him. But part of what God did in the process of our friendship was that he brought John to himself, and he used sometimes my words and my actions, and other people's too, not just me, to do that in John's life. And I remember baptizing him in the park and celebrating the transformation that had occurred in his life. But I think part of what happened in John's journey was that he belonged long before he believed. And that's what St. Patrick did. He would move into a village. He would move just outside of a village, and he would just begin to love those people. When they had needs, he would do what he could to meet those needs. When he could care for them, when he could be with the children, it was a culture that didn't value children as much, and he would spend time with the children. And he would just live there by those people and with those people. And it wasn't that he came in preaching right away, he came in loving. And he helped the people of Ireland gradually, slowly, one village at a time. He helped the people of Ireland know that they belonged long before they believed. And so they learned the love of God's people before they experienced what it was to be a part of God's people, to be a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ. Next thing is that St. Patrick didn't go alone, any more than I did in John's life. We were a group of people together in the church, and together we had influence in John's life. And, we don't do evangelism all by ourselves. We often think that, and sometimes we don't know what else is going on in an individual's life and who's having impact and how God is speaking into their lives. But part of what we need to understand is that St. Patrick, even though he gets a lot of the credit, he didn't go alone. He went with a group of people that were a part of his community that helped him love the people of Ireland. And as he moved through Ireland to the various places and faced incredible danger and persecution sometimes from the people who had formerly enslaved him, and he's a warlike, barbarian people in a lot of ways. So there were times he faced grave danger, and yet he didn't face that alone. He went with other people. And that group of people, as it gradually grew in number through people who became followers of Jesus Christ, that influence spread throughout the people of Ireland. So it's not something, evangelism and building bridges of grace isn't something we do all by ourselves. It's something we do in community. Third thing here is authenticity, credibility, and integrity. I think once we begin to live a lifestyle of building bridges of grace, once we understand our gospel identity, we begin to understand how vital it is that we live a life of integrity. Because if what it means for us to follow Jesus is inconsistent with the way we live, the people in our lives are going to see that rather quickly. If we talk about, loving God and have a relationship with Him, and yet we treat our employees, terribly, or we compromise in our morals. They see us, I don't know, all sorts of examples come to mind. But, if we don't have consistency, if we're not working at holiness in our lives, people see through that. And they're not going to be drawn to Jesus in us if there's not consistency in our lives. And I know at the same time that we're never going to be perfect. Hopefully we're growing in the process of what theologians call sanctification, that the Holy Spirit is making us more and more like Jesus as we grow in our relationship with Him. And that's changing. But part of what also is important, right along with integrity, is authenticity. That when we make mistakes, we're honest about it. We don't try to hide it. We don't try to cover it up. We want to be upfront about those things. I need the grace of Jesus Christ just as much as anybody else does. I am just as broken or more than the people that I'm in relationship with me. Just because I'm a follower of Jesus Christ doesn't mean I'm up here and somebody who doesn't is down here. I love D.T. Niles. He said this once. He said, I'm just a beggar. The only difference between me and every other beggar in the world is I know where the food is, right? That I just am excited because I know where the food is. I'm not up here telling you down there what you should do. I'm just another beggar who's found some bread. And I want to tell you where the bread is. Come eat. You can be satisfied. And Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. And I think that metaphor flows right into that we know where the bread of life is, and we want to show people that. And so our consistency in how we live and our authenticity about our brokenness is vital in how we build relationships with people. Circle of comfort. This is where we spend most of our time. This is where we love to hang out because it's the people we know, it's the places we are familiar with, it's where we find a lot of comfort and a lot of ease. So that's where we're drawn to, is that circle of comfort. That's where we want to be. But part of what it means to live out our gospel identity and to be obedient in the commission that God's given us, because that's what part of this is being obedient, is to understand that those who are outside the kingdom are represented by this star over here. They're the people who don't know what it means to have the grace of God in their lives. And part of what must happen is we have to move from our circle of comfort into the lives of people who are different than we are. And I know cool illustrations, pictures, moving things, all that. It's just, this is not rocket science, right? This is ultimately living out gospel obedience, is entering into the lives of people who don't know what it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And one of the biggest helps to me in this has been a book called The Art of Neighboring. And if I can find it, I'm going to show you that book. Here's the one I was talking about earlier. This is The Celtic Way of Evangelism by George Hunter. But there's another one here that I'm going to pull out, and it is called The Art of Neighboring. And the genius of this book is right here on the cover. Because that right here on the cover, if you can see it, is a grid. It's just a grid. You can draw one of these on any piece of paper. I have one at my office because I have neighbors around where the church is. I have one of these on the inside of my cupboard at home because I want to keep track of the neighbors that I know, and that's really all it is. And I tell you what, this simple thing, it's kind of Mickey Mouse, but it has been so helpful to me. Because Jesus calls us to love our neighbors, right? He calls us to love our neighbors. You cannot love your neighbor if you don't know their name. Can I get an amen? You just can't love your neighbor if you don't know their name. And part of what this helps me do is say, I got to know my neighbors. And one of the little quizzes they do, they have you make these squares on a piece of paper, and then they have A, B, and C. And A is the names of your neighbors. Know the names of your neighbors. B is something significant about their life. In other words, something that you find out about your neighbor that you couldn't know by just looking at their yard. You know, they drive a Tucson, you know. You can find that out by just looking over across the street. That's not what B is. B is you have to engage people in conversations and find out something significant about their life. C is deeper. That you find out something, some challenge that they're living with and some challenge that they're facing. And so A, B, and C, and you begin to fill out each one of those three things on that little grid in your cupboard or wherever you keep it at home, so that you're tangibly saying, how am I getting to know my neighbors? And I would just ask you right now, you can just pause it. We're done with this session right now. And when this session finishes, you just draw this grid, draw those boxes around your house and start to fill it out. And say, how many people can I name of the neighbors who live around me? How many can I say something significant about them? And see something deeper, hopes, dreams, challenges they're facing, things I'm praying for them about. And see how far you can get. When the writers of this book do this survey with the people that they talk to this book about as they travel and speak on this topic, when it gets to A, B, and C, you know, there's about 10% of followers of Jesus Christ who can do A, who can fill in all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 homes all around them. About 10% of followers of Jesus Christ can do that. When it gets to B, something significant, it goes down to about 7%. And when it gets to C, it goes down to 3%. That means that 97% of us don't know the hopes and dreams of the people who live closest to us, the people that we should be rubbing shoulders with, building relationships on a daily basis. 90% of followers of Christ don't even know the names of the people who live closest to them. I think we can change that. I'll see you next time.